There's a database maintained by the Kansas State Historical Society that lists every recorded orphan train stop in the state between 1866 and 1929. It contains town names, dates, the number of children placed, and the names of receiving families. Dry, bureaucratic columns that look like nothing until you put them next to something else. When you overlay that record with fire maps, specifically the insurance underwriter reports filed with the Kansas State Legislature between 1860 and 1880, something happens that is impossible to explain away as a coincidence. These reports document every town-level fire event serious enough to trigger a commercial loss claim. They're not dramatic documents, they are actuarial and precise. When you trace the actual routing of the orphan trains stop by stop and county by county, you find that the trains did not go to thriving towns or established farming communities with stable tax bases. Instead, an extraordinary number of the destinations had experienced a significant fire event within the preceding 3 to 7 years. This pattern held true across Kansas, Michigan, Indiana, Missouri, Nebraska, and Minnesota. The data does not support the story we have been told about what the orphan trains were actually for. The official history is one of the more emotionally legible stories in American social reform. Charles Loring Brace founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853 after documenting an army of street children in Lower Manhattan. His solution was removal: get children out of the corrupting urban environment and place them with wholesome rural families. Between 1854 and 1929, roughly 250,000 children made that journey. This has been framed as philanthropy for so long that the framing has become invisible. However, Brace was not primarily a humanitarian, he was an economist. His 1872 book, The Dangerous Classes of New York, is a tract about urban labor surplus and social control. He was explicit that street children represented a criminal class in formation, and the program was designed to drain off this population before it could radicalize or cost the city. This framing matters enormously when you look at where the trains actually went. In 1871, Fresno County, California, lost approximately 40% of its agricultural infrastructure to fire. Orphan train stops began appearing there within 5 years. In 1873, a fire in central Illinois destroyed grain storage and killed numerous farm workers. Orphan train stops appeared there by 1876. In 1874, a fire in Macon, Georgia, displaced 400 families. Placement records show the county receiving children by 1877. There is a counterargument. Towns that had recently burned were in active rebuilding phases and needed labor. If you were routing trains toward places that could absorb children into working households, you would naturally weight them toward places with labor deficits. This argument is correct, but it also confirms that the orphan trains were a labor routing operation wearing the costume of a child welfare program. A child welfare program asks if a child is safe and loved. A labor routing operation asks if the destination received adequate workers at an acceptable cost. The Children's Aid Society's own records suggest which question they were actually asking. Brace tracked placements by a metric called industrial absorption, measuring whether a child had been integrated into productive labor. Letters from receiving families were evaluated based on whether the child was working and if the family, the customer, was satisfied. The families were the ones who funded the operation. This leads to an uncomfortable paper trail. The Children's Aid Society received substantial support from New York's merchant and manufacturing class, including the railroad industry. The Erie Railroad and the New York Central had direct economic interests in the Western Territories. These railroads did not charge full fare for the orphan train cars. They offered deeply discounted rates that amounted to near subsidization. Railroads developing land grants in underpopulated territories were subsidizing the transport of labor disguised as charity. An internal operational memo from approximately 1869 discusses routing considerations, prioritizing communities exhibiting conditions favorable to absorption. This language was written about children. The children themselves were never told where they were going. Survivor accounts from the 1980s and 90s confirmed that they were told they were going to good homes, but they were never given the name of the destination town or receiving family. This was not an oversight. Placement guidelines explicitly instructed agents not to provide children with information about alternative contacts until a placement was deemed stable, defined as one full agricultural season. If a placement was brutal, a child had no legal recourse and no way to contact their biological families. I have searched for a single instance where an agent objected to routing children to a recently burned town as replacement labor. I have not found it. What I did find was an 1882 letter from an agent named Catherine Sellers. She noted that children in one Iowa community were well occupied but not schooled, performing labor she described as intensive for their ages. She asked if it was appropriate to continue sending children there. Her supervisor's response was 3 sentences. He noted the families were satisfied and instructed her to proceed. She continued making placements there for 4 more years. The economic logic explains a humanitarian puzzle. The movement operated for 75 years, often underfunded and staffed by true believers who thought they were saving children. But the funding came from people motivated by the economics of territorial development. In the late 19th century, land cleared by fire or population loss needed to be repopulated with cheap, controllable labor. The Orphan Trains were the largest internal migration program in American history before the New Deal, run through private hands and funded by the industries that benefited from the migration. We called it charity because that was the only language available to move that many children without triggering a legal response. When you call it an organized labor transfer, the routing decisions and the burn towns look very different. Oral histories from the 1930s describe the arrival of these trains not as charitable occasions, but as market days. Children were lined up on platforms while families walked through and selected them. One account from Pottawatomie County, Kansas, describes how the bigger boys were wanted first, while the smaller ones were left waiting. If placed, that boy would have spent his childhood working land that had seen multiple significant fires. He would have had no address for his biological family and a present defined entirely by the labor needs of the family that selected him. His grandchildren would eventually be told a family story that began with a trunk on a platform. The orphan trains are taught as a well-intentioned but flawed experiment, but the well-intentioned framing asks us to ignore the structure of the funding and the logic of the routing. The burned towns were not accidents, they were the point. The children who arrived on those platforms never knew enough to ask the questions that would have unraveled the arrangement. Where did you find us? Why here? And why now? The documents know the answer, even if the children never did.